At EO 844 on June 15, 1944, the Pacific was boiling. First Lieutenant Frank Tachsky crouched in the well of a Higgins boat, the steel ramp in front of him slamming up and down with each wave. 300 yards ahead, the southern beaches of Saipan were a mess of smoke, fire, and geysers of sand thrown up by Japanese artillery. They were already in the killing zone. A shell fell short off the port bow, detonating in the surf. The blast slapped the boat sideways, drenching everyone inside with warm, salty water and fragments of coral. Somewhere to starboard, another LCVP disappeared in a white-orange blossom, marines and planks flung into the air. Tachsky didn't flinch. He didn't have room to. He was wedged between the engine housing and the forward bulkhead, a Thompson across his chest, a car-bar in a low-slung sheath, map case jammed into the crook of his arm. Behind him, packed shoulder to shoulder, 40 men rowed the bucking boat with an eerie, almost defiant calm. Every single one of them had come out of the brig. They were tattooed knuckles and busted noses, scars from bar fights and dock brawls rebranded as combat potential. One had been a professional boxer. One had done muscle work for a Chicago outfit before the war. 6 had rap sheets for assault or theft back home. The Marine Corps called them troublemakers. Tachsky called them survivors. Officially they were 1st Platoon, Scout Sniper Detachment, 6th Marine Regiment. 40 men tasked with slipping behind Japanese lines, alone, on an island held by an estimated 30,000 enemy troops. Mission: land with the first waves, break away from the beachhead, disappear into the interior, spend days alone in enemy-held jungle, mapping fortifications, killing sentries, calling in naval gunfire and artillery on anything big that moved. Intelligence said Japanese garrison, including Army troops and Navy personnel, was around 30,000. Civilian population, even larger. Terrain, cane fields, ridges, coral cliffs, caves. Casualty estimates for Marine Scout sniper operations in the Pacific? Roughly 73%. If the numbers were right, maybe a dozen of the men behind him would live long enough to see Hawaii again. They knew it. He'd seen it in their eyes at Camp Tarawa on the Big Island, when the instructors had talked about expected losses like they were reading weather reports. A shell screamed overhead, close enough to make the air vibrate in his teeth. The coxswain cursed, fighting the wheel. Spray punched in over the gunnels, soaking the men's dungarees and web gear. 2 minutes! The coxswain bellowed. Behind Tachsky, someone chuckled, low and rough, probably O'Malley, the ex-boxer. "Hey, LT," came a voice from behind, thick Brooklyn. "You sure the brig wasn't safer?" "Shut up and check your ammo," Tachsky snapped back without turning. He risked a peek over the gunnel. The battlefield ahead was nightmare cinema. Sherman tanks already burning where they'd bogged in soft sand or taken direct hits, LVTs churning through the surf, Marines hugging the low dunes under machine gun and mortar fire. Smoke thickened the air. The hillside beyond the beach flashed continuously with muzzle blasts from well-hidden Japanese positions. These first waves were headed straight into that meat grinder. His platoon was not supposed to stay with them. Their job was to cut inland as soon as they had a foothold, slip through the chaos, and vanish up the ravines and ridges the Japanese thought were safe. Marine planners, sobered by the bloodbath at Tarawa 7 months earlier, had finally accepted a brutal fact. Charging straight across open reef and beach into unsurveyed, unsoftened fortifications was a good way to stack bodies. Colonel James Risley of the 6th Marines had pushed for a different approach. He'd asked for, and gotten, permission to build a unit of men who didn't think like regular Marines. Men who could move unseen, kill silently, report precisely, and survive on their own in a jungle full of people trying to make them dead. Men like the 40 behind Tachsky. 30 seconds, yelled the coxswain. Machine gun rounds smacked the front ramp, punching neat holes in the steel inches from Tachsky's knees. Another artillery shell hit so close the boat felt like it had jumped sideways off a ledge. "Get ready," he shouted, throat raw. "Remember, "We're not staying on that beach. We cut left, find the draw, and we're ghosts. Stay bunched, stay low, don't stop for anything." He could see the beach now between blasts. Tan sand, dark bodies, motion, chaos. Behind him, 40 criminals turned scouts flexed their hands on rifles, Thompsons and Springfields with scope mounts. Their eyes were narrow, some hungry, some scared, all wired. They'd spent 6 months training for this. Saipan would be their first full combat test. The ramp slammed down with a clang. The world turned into a mix of spray, sand, noise, and tracers. And the men the Marine Corps had once written off as problems ran straight into the teeth of a Japanese island garrison, toward a style of warfare that would, years later, help give birth to something called the Navy SEALs. Cut. 7 months before Saipan, the lagoon at Tarawa had turned red. In November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division had hit Betio Atoll in the Gilberts. Misread tides left LVTs and Higgins boats stranded on reefs. Marines waded hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under direct fire. In just 76 hours of fighting, the Marines lost 994 killed and over 2,000 wounded, taking a single small island. Colonel James Risley of the 6th Marine Regiment walked those blasted beaches and counted the cost. Men chewed up by bunkers they hadn't known were there, wiped out in front of pillboxes no one had spotted from the air. Tarawa taught a savage lesson. You couldn't just pound an island with ships and planes and assume you'd killed everything. Japanese fortifications were deeper, more cunning, and more resilient than pre-invasion reconnaissance had suggested. Better intelligence up front could have saved lives. Risley wasn't alone in thinking that, but he had an idea the other colonels didn't. Standard Marine training produced excellent riflemen, solid assault troops, men who could follow orders, move forward when told, and hold under fire. What he needed for the next island wasn't more straight arrow jarheads. He needed men who thought sideways, men comfortable working in the dark and the gray, men who already knew how to move without being seen, to find weak spots in defenses, to take things that weren't theirs and not get caught. In short, he needed criminals. At Camp Tarawa in Hawaii, named grimly after the battle they were trying not to repeat, Risley circulated a peculiar request to company commanders across the 2nd Marine Division. "I want your troublemakers," he said, "your brawlers, your thieves, the ones who think they're smarter than the system, the men you'd just as soon see sent to the brig. I want them." The logic was brutal and a little unhinged, but so was the war. Punishment. Jima's details in the Corps were full of men who'd swung fists too easily, who'd taken what wasn't theirs, who'd mouthed off to the wrong sergeant one time too many. In peacetime, they were discipline cases. In a meat grinder of island warfare, they might be exactly the kind of bastard you wanted in a small team behind enemy lines. First Lieutenant Frank Tachsky, a stocky Pennsylvanian who'd already earned a reputation as both a solid officer and a man who didn't mind getting his hands dirty, got the job. "Here's how I pick 'em," he told one skeptical captain. 2 Marines get into a fight. The loser goes to the infirmary. The winner goes to the brig. I want the winner. It wasn't just about fists. Over 2 months, Tachsky visited brigs and punishment outfits all over the 2nd Marine Division. He read charge sheets. He talked to NCOs. More importantly, he looked the men in the eye. He asked them questions other officers didn't. When you stole that truck, how did you get past the MPs? When you ran that gambling ring, how did you keep it quiet as long as you did? When you knocked that sergeant out, what were you thinking? Most had criminal records before the Corps grabbed them. Petty theft, assault, burglary. One had busted a man's jaw in a dockside bar in Philadelphia. Another, the quiet one from Chicago, had worked as security for a local gangster, code for carrying a sap and an illegal pistol, and using both when needed. The Marines gave them a choice: military prison, or combat duty in a unit with a very high chance of not coming back. They chose combat. By the end of the recruitment sweep, 42 men reported to the scrubby lava fields and half-built huts of Camp Tarawa as his new platoon. The youngest was 17, a scrawny kid who'd lied about his age and then punched a corporal. The oldest was 34, a broad-shouldered brawler with cauliflower ears and a nose that had been broken more times than anyone could remember. They weren't pretty. They weren't polite. They were, in Tachsky's eyes, exactly what he needed. Other officers shook their heads. "You're building a platoon out of the brig rats?" one major scoffed. "You're either a genius or you've lost your damn mind, Frank." "Maybe both, Tachsky," he replied. He didn't tell them the piece that lived only in his own head. If these men were going to die, and the casualty table said they probably would, then they might as well take as many Japanese with them as possible, doing something that saved other Marines' lives. Tarawa's ghosts needed to be paid back. Saipan would be the first installment. Camp Tarawa wasn't much to look at. Raw lava fields on the big island of Hawaii, wind that cut through dungarees, thin grass trying to claim ground between cinder cones. The only upside was the view inland. Mauna Kea's bulk looming, snow-capped, while Marines sweated below. For Tachsky's 42 misfits, it was home and crucible. Their training wasn't like regular infantry drill. They'd already done close order, rifle qual, bayonet practice. What they needed now were skills the Corps didn't officially teach, or pretended not to. Silent killing came first. A British commando sergeant, on loan from the other side of the Pacific War, showed them how to come up behind a sentry, step into his shadow, and take him down with a knife between ribs or a forearm under the jaw, cutting off the shout before it formed. They practiced on sandbags, on dummies, on each other with blunted blades and padded grips, until every man could perform the moves half asleep. Hand-to-hand got serious. O'Malley, the ex-boxer, turned into an instructor overnight. He taught them how to use elbows in close, how to stomp ankles, how to headbutt without knocking yourself out. "If he gets this close," he'd growl, tapping a man's helmet with his forehead, "forget Queensberry. You fight like you're in an alley in Baltimore and his buddies have knives." Jungle movement drills turned them into ghosts. They learned to move through cane fields and scrub without rattling dry stalks, to step over roots and through brush without leaving obvious sign. At night, they crawled towards simulated Japanese positions marked only by faint lantern glow, instructors watching through night glasses. Any snap of a twig, any silhouette against the stars, meant getting hauled up and sent back to do it again. They trained with M1903 Springfield rifles fitted with 8x unertl scopes, old-school iron updated with glass. At 600 yards, they listened. Earned to hit man-sized silhouettes in crosswinds, to dial for range without thinking, to control breathing so the reticle settled and cut clean. They weren't just shooters, they were observers. Officers from the naval gunfire liaison teams came out and taught them how to talk to ships and batteries, how to read a map and a gridded overlay, how to say, in precise language, "Regimental HQ here, 375mm guns here, Inferno if you please." They studied captured Japanese maps and field manuals, learned the kanji for common unit insignia, practiced recognizing rank badges and helmet markings so they'd know who to kill first when a patrol walked under their noses. Then there was thieving. Marines were already notorious scroungers. The Corps got leftovers, surplus Springfields from World War I, obsolete radios, rations that British Tommies had refused. If you wanted decent gear in 1944, you stole it, from Navy depots, Army supply dumps, or anyone careless enough to leave a crate unattended. Tachsky's platoon treated it like a career path. They raided Army warehouses for better boots, socks, extra canned peaches. They liberated waterproof radios from a Navy communicator. Once they even stole a half-dozen brand-new rubber boats from an amphibious tractor battalion storage tent, then quietly returned 3 and kept 3 for training purposes. When someone grumbled about it, a staff sergeant shrugged. "They're criminals," he said. "At least now they're stealing for our side." At night, when regular units were lights out, the scout snipers were in the scrub above camp, setting up simulated observation posts, moving by stars, learning landmarks by feel. They practiced calling in live fire from artillery on distant ridges, watching rounds walk across target grids they'd selected hours before. They took turns playing the enemy, dropping into cane fields and trying to stay unseen while their buddies hunted them with scopes and radios. By late spring, they weren't a collection of brig rats anymore. They were a blunt, illegal thing honed into an edge. Silent killers. Crack shots. Thieves with radios and maps. Men who could work days beyond friendly lines on hard rations and cigarettes, sending back coordinates and head counts. Their reputation leaked into the rest of the division. "Don't piss off Tachsky's wolves," one Marine told another. "They'll steal your rations and then steal the Japs' trenches." The brass still didn't fully trust them. Some saw a time bomb, concentrated discipline cases with weapons and advanced training. Risley saw something else. A prototype for the kind of small, specialized reconnaissance and direct action unit the Navy and Marines would realize they needed again and again in wars to come. On paper, they were just a scout sniper platoon. In practice, they were something closer to a 20th century raiding tribe. Saipan would decide whether the experiment survived or died on a coral beach. The first minutes on Yellow Beach 2 were a blur of ducked heads and shouted curses. The ramp went down into knee-deep surf. Mortar shells were already bracketed onto the sand. Japanese machine guns, hidden in coral pillboxes and spider holes, chewed at the waterline. Regular rifle companies stumbled, fell, surged forward in bursts. Some made the seawall, others didn't. Tachsky and his platoon hit the sand, then cut left immediately per plan. "Off the beach!" he screamed, voice gone ragged. "Into the draw! Move!" The men followed, sprinting low, packs slapping, boots slipping on wet coral. 2 went down to random shrapnel, 1 dead, 1 screaming, leg folded wrong. They had to leave them. There was no time. No corpsmen, no slack. In the narrow ravine leading inland, a natural drainage gully choked with jungle growth and broken rock, they finally had cover from direct fire. By the time most Marines were still slugging it out across the flat open beachhead, the criminals were already vanishing up a fold in the island. They moved in 3- and 4-man fire teams. Each team had 1 sniper with a scoped .03, 1 scout with a carbine or Thompson, 1 radio man with a stolen battery-heavy SCR 300 on his back, 1 demolition man with a bag of TNT blocks and pre-cut fuses. Their first day was a long, bloody walk. They skirted cane fields where Japanese infantry were already digging in. They avoided draws where mortar crews had perfect arcs onto the beach. They slid through patches of jungle that smelled of rot and cordite, stepping around the bodies of Japanese soldiers killed by naval gunfire in the pre-landing bombardment. By noon, they were 1.5 miles inland. By nightfall, nearly 3. They found their first serious prize at dusk, a Japanese artillery battery dug into a reverse slope position, 4 150mm guns camouflaged under netting and brush, muzzle blast channel. It led through narrow slots cut in the hillside. From the beach, those guns were invisible. From the air, they were just lumps of rock. From 20 yards away, looking down through a tangle of ferns, Tachsky could see the whole position like it was laid out on a sand table. He signaled for his men to stay down. 2 snipers crawled forward, finding lanes through the foliage. Below, Japanese officers moved between the guns, shouting orders. Ammunition runners hauled heavy shells from a dugout. Crews swung breech blocks and swabbed barrels. Each of those guns was likely responsible for dozens of dead Marines on the beaches. Taking them by direct assault would have been suicide. Taking them by radio and mathematics was exactly what the scout snipers had trained for. Tachsky plotted the battery's position on his map, checked and cross-checked, then tapped the radio man. "Get me Navy," he said. Minutes later, far offshore, the gunnery officer aboard a cruiser adjusted his tables, listened to the calm American voice giving him grid coordinates and corrections from somewhere deep in Saipan's interior, and gave the order to fire. The first salvo landed long. Plumes of earth and smoke rose beyond the battery. Drop 200. Right 50, Tachsky said into the handset, eyes on the target. Second salvo walked in. One shell hit directly on the roof of a gun pit. The camo net lifted like a rag tossed by a giant. When it fell, there was no gun underneath. Repeat! Repeat! Tachsky snapped. Within 3 minutes, the entire battery was turned into a cratered, smoking smear on the hillside. Men who would have killed unknown numbers of Marines the next day were now part of a chalk line in someone else's after-action report. That was the pattern for the next days. Move at night, hide by day, observe, record, transmit. Occasionally, strike, silently. On their third night inland, O'Malley's team slipped into the edge of a Japanese bivouac area. Rows of foxholes, stacked rifles, men asleep under shelter halves, a faint, sweet smell of sake. The mission was recon, not massacre, but one group of Japanese soldiers had set up a field telephone with wires running up the hill toward what must be a regimental command post. Kill the phone, slow the reaction. 2 men belly-crawled along the wire, found the small camouflage switchboard in a dugout under a pandanus tree. The operator never saw the knife. They cut the wires in 3 places, left a grenade behind the console on a pull-pin delay, and faded back into the dark before the explosion snapped everyone upright shouting. By then, the scout snipers were gone. Their reports over the next week mapped exactly where Japanese machine gun nests covered the main avenues inland, which draws were mined, which were left suspiciously open, where caves on the cliffs housed reserve companies and ammunition dumps. Every morning, Marines and Army troops attacking from the beachhead walked into positions softened or obliterated overnight by ship guns and artillery, called in off positions Tachsky's criminals had marked. Every time a battalion advanced into a gap that should have costed 100 men but didn't, some colonel, deep in the planning tent, circled a coordinate on a map and said, "That came from the scout snipers." The Japanese started to notice something too. Patrols began to vanish in ravines. Sentries were sometimes found with neat bullet holes in their helmets or cut throats, no shots heard. They sent hunting parties into the interior. They found footprints, empty ration tins, the ends of cigarette butts, but rarely the men themselves. The Marines' reputation as thieves and brawlers evolved in Japanese field gossip into something closer to forest spirits, dangerous, unseen, striking at night. It was a kind of proto-special operations warfare in miniature. Small units, deep infiltration, intelligence-driven firepower. Men like Tachsky and his misfits were writing tactics on the ground that, 20 years later, would feel very familiar to SEAL trainees reading their own manuals. Captain Nakamura, commanding a rifle company of the 43rd Division on Saipan, had fought Chinese guerrillas in the hills of Hunan. He knew what it was like to face an enemy you couldn't quite see. The Americans were not supposed to be that enemy. They were supposed to be blunt force, naval bombardment, screaming corsairs and hellcats, then waves of Marines in green dungarees and steel helmets charging across open sand with bayonets and grenades, brave, predictable, bloody. On Saipan's first days, that image held. Nakamura's men had watched the beaches through periscope slits in bunkers, seen the first waves hit mines and interlocking fields of fire, heard the cries. But as the fighting moved inland, something changed. Positions he had prepared, machine gun nests with perfect arcs, were disappearing overnight. Artillery that had never fired a shot went up in sudden offshore bombardments, rounds walking in with chilling precision. Phone lines he relied on for coordinating counterattacks were cut in the small hours. Operators found dead at their posts with a single thrust or a single distant, unseen shot to the head. Patrols sent to hunt the infiltrators often returned light or not at all. Those who came back spoke of glimpses, a flicker of movement in thick brush, then a comrade dropping with a hole in his forehead, footprints that vanished into rocky ground, positions near the front where, in the dark, a low American voice would call in perfect Japanese, luring men out of cover. Rumors seeded among the troops, special American troops, some said, not regular Marines, criminals released from prison and sent only to kill at night. Others invoked older fears. Yamabushi, one private whispered, mountain ghosts. Nakamura didn't care what they called them. He cared what they were doing. In a nighttime company commander's meeting in a cave headquarters, he raised the problem. "Enemy scouts are penetrating our rear," he said. "They mark our positions for their naval guns. They kill our sentries. Our men are afraid." The regimental operations officer, a stocky man with little patience for superstition, frowned. "All scouts can be killed," he said. "Increase your patrols. Use more flares. Set more tripwires." They did. The Americans adapted. Tripwires got marked and stepped over. Flares were lured into premature detonation by tossed rocks and thrown helmets. Patrols that moved noisily at night became magnets for ambushes. Their officers started to hang back. Behind this cat and mouse was a simple change in how one side thought about the terrain. To most Marines, the jungle and ravines of Saipan were obstacles between them and the next objective line. To Tachsky's platoon, they were home turf. They learned to use the island's coral ridges as acoustic shields, firing one shot from a sniper hide, then melting sideways so any return lightning struck a different hill. They used stolen Japanese uniforms, not full suits, just tunics or caps, in specific situations, moving through certain draws at dawn, just long enough to step past half-asleep pickets. They were, in modern terms, conducting deep reconnaissance and direct action missions days ahead of conventional lines, living on stolen rice and spam pilfered from army dumps. At one point, a four-man team spent 48 hours watching a single cave entrance where a Japanese regimental staff worked. They logged comings and goings, counted officers by rank insignia, mapped radio antennae. Then they called in a meticulously plotted naval gunfire mission. 3 8-inch shells later, the cave was sealed, and most of a regiment's brains trust was buried alive. The casualties the Japanese took directly from the platoon's rifles and knives were in the dozens. The casualties they took from artillery and naval gunfire directed by those criminals turned scouts climbed into the thousands. In war diaries and post-action interviews, some Japanese officers would low and remark on the invisible Americans, who seemed to know their dispositions as if by magic. It wasn't magic. It was 40 men from the wrong side of the tracks, given the right training, turned loose with radios. By the end of the Saipan campaign, the 6th Marines Scout Sniper Platoon had taken terrible losses. Of the 42 men who'd shipped out of Camp Tarawa, only around 20 were still fully fit for duty. Several more were wounded and evac'd. A few were listed as missing, bodies never recovered from ravines or caves where firefights had gone bad. Casualties approached the brutal 70+% that the planners had predicted. But the ledger on the other side of the balance sheet looked different now. Regimental and divisional intelligence sections had thick files of sketches, grid references, and after-action reports credited to Scout Sniper Detachment. Landing force commanders had learned, often the hard way, to ask, "What do the scouts say about that ridge?" before sending battalions uphill. Navy liaison officers had whole pages of naval gunfire logs where the initial spotting and corrections came from a raspy Marine voice somewhere up the island, not from spotter planes. In the smoke tents and chart rooms where future operations were being planned, Tinian, Guam, then the Marianas and beyond, an idea was hardening. We need more of this. We need dedicated units whose sole job is to go in first, close, unseen, to wreck obstacles, to map beaches, to kill what needs killing quietly and mark what needs killing loudly by somebody else. The Navy was already thinking along similar lines. Combat demolition units, little teams of swimmers and engineers, had begun clearing beach obstacles in the European theater. In the Pacific, the first underwater demolition teams, UDTs, were forming. On Saipan and its sister islands, Navy officers had watched what Marine Scout snipers could do on land. Some of Tachsky's men had even moonlighted with Navy officers at night, creeping down to reef edges to recon surf conditions and obstacle belts before follow-on landings. One of those officers, in a post-war interview kept deep in a Naval Historical Center file, said, "The Marines had these characters, who could move through the worst terrain I've ever seen and come back with exactly what you needed to know. If we could find the same sort of men to work from the water in, we'd have something very special. After the war, as the United States tried to make sense of what had worked and what hadn't, two threads converged. The Navy's UDTs and combat swimmer units who'd cleared reefs and blown up obstacles from Normandy to Okinawa. The Marines and Army's small, elite reconnaissance and raider outfits, men like the scout snipers of Saipan, the Marine Raiders, the OSS maritime units. When President Kennedy, in 1962, formally stood up the first Navy SEAL teams, their lineage was traced to the UDTs. But their ethos, the idea of small, aggressive teams operating deep behind lines, combining reconnaissance, direct action, and the ability to call down overwhelming firepower, owed just as much to places like Saipan. To dirty fighters and disciplined thieves who'd proven that men with criminal court dockets could, under the right commander, become the kind of operators you built future doctrine around. Some of Tachsky's survivors never left that world. A couple rotated into training roles, quietly feeding lessons learned into the next generation of Marines and Navy special operators. Others, restless in peacetime, found their way into early CIA paramilitary programs where their Saipan-honed skill set fit too well to ignore. Frank Tachsky went home carrying the ghosts of half his platoon. He never became famous. No blockbuster movie immortalized his unit. Official histories mention elite reconnaissance elements in a line or two, if at all. But among those who knew, Marines, sailors, and later SEALs who cared about where their methods came from, the story of the platoon of criminals at Saipan made the rounds. They'd been troublemakers, brawlers, thieves. And when you pointed them at 30,000 Japanese and told them, "Go behind them, break their eyes and ears and don't come back until the job's done," they'd done it, at horrible cost. But effectively. But years later, in a classroom at Coronado, a SEAL instructor clicked through a slide deck. Most of the young faces in the room knew the outlines of their unit's official ancestry: scouts and raiders, naval combat demolition units, underwater demolition teams in the Pacific. On one slide, a grainy black-and-white photo appeared. 40 ragged men in W2 Marine dungarees, some bare-chested, some with bandanas, most with that indefinable look of men who'd seen too much and were ready, somehow, for more. The caption read, "6th Marines, Scout Sniper Platoon, Saipan, 1944. "Who were they?" a candidate asked. "Criminals," the instructor said. "At least on paper. Marines pulled from brigs and punishment battalions, picked because they were mean enough to live through what we were about to ask of them." He told the abbreviated story: Tarawa's bloodbath, Colonel Risley's experiment, Camp Tarawa training that taught them to kill with knives, move like ghosts, steal everything they needed, and talk to ships with cool precision. He told them about Saipan, about the platoon's movement 3 miles inland while the main force was still on the sand, about artillery positions erased by guns offshore because a few thieves with scopes had put crosshairs in the right spot, about patrols that never came back because a hand-picked wolf pack had cut their throats in the dark. He mentioned, almost in passing, that casualties in the unit topped 70%, and that those who lived were exactly the kind of men later recruiters looked for in special operations foundations. "You like to think you're new," he said, "but most of what we do, some angry Marine with too many brig chits probably did in 44 with less kit and more malaria." In a VFW hall somewhere in Pennsylvania, an old man in civilian clothes might clink ice in a glass and, if asked the right way, talk a little about Saipan. He wouldn't. To use words like SEALs or special operations, he'd say things like, "We got in the way. We saw where Jerry, well, Jap this time, had his guns. We told our ships where to shoot. We did things at night you don't write home about. We stole a lot of Navy chow." He might mention, with a rough chuckle, that half the platoon had arrived in Hawaii straight from the brig. "Funny thing is," he'd say, Some of those boys ended up shaping how the fancy frogmen do things now. War has a way of taking men society doesn't quite know what to do with, and under pressure, turning them into exactly the kind of fighters it suddenly realizes it needs. 40 criminals in a Higgins boat off Saipan probably didn't think of themselves as anything but Marines with a worse-than-usual chance of survival. But when they cut, inland, alone, against a garrison of 30,000, when they killed quietly, stole boldly, and pointed naval guns at the right hill at the right time, they were sketching the outlines of a new kind of warfare. One where small teams carried more than their share of the fight behind enemy lines. One where the line between thief and operator blurred under the weight of necessity. And one where, decades later, men wearing blue tridents on their chests would look back and recognize, in those dirty, dangerous Marines from Camp Tarawa, an uncomfortable echo of themselves. The Navy SEALs would trace their patchwork lineage through many units and many oceans. Some of that DNA, whether the recruiters like to admit it or not, runs straight through a platoon of brig rats who hit Saipan's beaches in 1944, then vanished into the jungle to hunt an army 10 times their size.